Good morning, and thanks for coming. I was delivered a shock at this meeting. I don't usually get surprised at meetings, but I thought I was the old man in the industry. Frank had me beat. One year.
Thank you. I want to make sure I'm going to take that.
So I started Jon
The
Peddie
most
Research.
experienced person.
I started Jon Peddie Research 1 year after Frank was already at Intel. And so it's hard to live with that. So the idea is, let's see the future. Can we see the future? And I think, of course, we can. In fact, we do it every day, whether we realize it or not. But there's a certain amount of, let's say, hesitation and maybe even fear of the future, because we don't know what it's going to be, and that's always upsetting to some people. So therefore, they like to try and stay in the past. I'm advising don't stay in the past. There's no profit in doing that. Real quickly about us, we track the pixel. We follow it from its inception, from its capture through its processing and out to its display. So imagine that you were at a conference like this back in 1833, and Charles Babbage had just developed his analytical engine. And if anybody here doesn't know what that is, hard to imagine, but I'll explain. It basically was an enormous machine, which you can see, by the way, in London at the Science Museum. A machine that's about as big as this platform, and it consisted of gears and pulleys and things, and it did analog computation of differential equations to come to a solution which was printed out, believe it or not. They developed the first printer, and Babbage's wife, Ada, I'm sure you've heard that term before, Ada was her name, developed the first programming language, and that was considered a revolutionary thing, except that in the audience, when he was presenting that, there was a guy who maybe didn't look too smart, said, nah, gears, that's not the way to do it. We're going to use this new thing I've invented called an actuator. And an actuator will let us do logical on and off computing. And they said, yeah, okay, let's get rid of that guy because he's obviously nuts. Except that, a few years later, in 1935, some crazy German actually built one. And Konrad Zuse built this in his basement and had it running and demonstrated it. And then World War II happened, and so he got called into duty, and it didn't get developed as quickly as it should have. But the Zuse relay computer ran at Siemens as a functional computer up until 1950, believe it or not. That's a little sidebar on that. But then John Ambrose came. He was an English guy, and he said, why would we use relays? Let me tell you about these little glass bulbs that I've invented that have electrons going in them, and we can actually do better things than you can do with those relay things. And they said, yeah, okay, we don't need to hear from you anymore. Until he was asked to retire. And that's Frank on the left there, by the way. But then in 1939, at a conference in a science building in Iowa, not a lot of people know about this, the first vacuum tube computer was made. I put the arrow in there to try and call your attention. Those are the tubes down there. It's not very obvious from this very old photograph, the only photograph that exists of that machine. But that machine predated, and in fact was a catalyst for the development of a machine that you all know, which is called ENIAC, which looked like this. And so this was not really the first vacuum tube computer. But like everything else, there was a visitor from England, and he looked at that and he said, but it's so big. Why does it have to be that big? And these vacuum tube things, I can do that with semiconductors. Because he already had done it in Manchester, England. And you can see this machine also at the incredible museum in Manchester. If you ever get to go to Manchester, take a day and spend it there. But that wasn't the end either, because there was this guy from Texas who came up and he said, but why is it so big? I can do it like that in this integrated circuit that I've invented. He wasn't last to come back to England, didn't matter. And then the craziest of all guys, a guy by the name, guy by the name of Freeman, said, why don't we build computers like quantums? And quantum computing is really challenging because it defies the laws of binary logic as we understand it. because a quantum computer can be a 1 or a 0 simultaneously. And that just makes your mind kind of go, and other people came up with this idea. Point of fact is that Intel is working on quantum computers, so is IBM and others, and they are already in operation. Quantum computers have proved themselves to be very, very powerful at doing encryption and decoding. So how far out is our future? Well, some personal stories here. I proposed a computer in 1999 that would be a fully integrated thing with a little processor that was surrounded by memory and so forth, but I couldn't figure out how to turn it on. And a friend of mine who was at Sun said, you just turn it on with light. It never occurred to me to do that. I also had the idea that why don't we use the encoding process that exists in our bodies called DNA, and think about the memory capacity you could get doing that. Well, it turns out that IBM is now working on just such a project. So the future is always there and it's almost always attainable, but there's two types of futures. There's one where it's really beyond our let's say, daily conscience, and that's the kind of stuff that we call science fiction. That's where people come up with really fantastic ideas. They take leaps of imagination that most people don't get. And then there's the future that is extrapolated future, where we're building something today and it's at, let's say, 14 nanometers process capability. Well, obviously we're going to be able to get to 10 and then to 7 and then to 5 and so forth. So that's an extrapolated future that we can do. And Moore's Law has taught us that. Moore's Law has shown us the way to do a very progressive and realizable future. Just a footnote on this, that picture there is a picture of the giant computer that's operated by the Krell. And if you have never seen a movie called Forbidden Planet, made in 53, or 56 rather, I encourage you to go to Netflix and get that, because it really was an extremely advanced thought process computer, including the first faster than light spaceships, and a robot that actually had a personality. So I said to Neil, when I heard about this conference, can I please come to the conference, please? And he said, no, John, I'm sorry, we had you once before and it didn't work out well. But he said, he would just let me, because Wanda, she canceled, and so there was an opening. He said, okay, you can take Wanda's slot, but you have to talk about numbers because people expect you to talk about numbers. So here's some numbers. The point of this chart is that things are not exploding. They almost never have exploded. The exception to that would be perhaps the PC explosion in the early 80s. That was pretty phenomenal and wonderful, and we all benefited from that. And then the smartphone explosion. Those are two that I can recall. There may have been others, but generally speaking, we don't have explosive markets. They kind of develop as people get used to accepting them. And you can see we pretty much stabilized now. We have mature markets and all those things. We thought, or a lot of people thought, I didn't personally, but a lot of people thought that the VR market was going to be such an explosive experience. It didn't take a lot of analysis to realize why that couldn't be. And I should point out that VR, as Neil has mentioned, has been with us for quite some time, since the 90s. I've personally been involved with VR since 92. And VR was and still is used in scientific and engineering every day and does useful and important work. What happened was Facebook made a ridiculous investment in a startup company, and that investment attracted so much attention, $2 billion, that attracts attention. And it took the idea that VR was going to be a consumer product. So whereas it was always operating in the scientific area, it still is, now we get the idea, okay, here comes a new consumer thing. And we're always looking for the next great consumer thing. But it didn't happen. Whether or not it ever happens, it's still argumentative. I'm not convinced it's going to, but like I say, it's argumentative, so I may or may not be right. However, other people have changed their view as well with regard to the explosiveness of it and have modified their views whilst still maintaining a nice looking growth. So the light blue part of that chart is VR and the dark blue part is AR. I personally think the chart's upside down, and I have other lectures I can give you on that, but not time today. Nonetheless, the gaming market which I think is the big market and continues to grow and shows great promise, is what really is propelling all of the platforms that I showed you as being flat. And if you look at some of the companies in the industry, you'll see that their sales and their volumes have gone up, whilst the PC market has wobbled. The PC market, by the way, has stabilized and is starting to go back up again, which I'm happy to say I predicted that. But aside from my greatness, the fact is that gaming has pulled the PC market up. And a lot of that is due to what Frank was discussing this morning about the volume of gamers out there. And he said everybody's a gamer. All you have to do is get on an airplane and look at what people are doing with smartphones and tablets on an airplane. They're either watching a movie or they're playing a game. They're not doing email, they're not doing whatever else one could do. And gaming includes things like crossword puzzles. I've seen a lot of people doing crossword puzzles on a PC. So we are all gamers, whether you recognize it or not. Now, another area that's developing, and we're just trying to get some numbers on this, is a thing called streaming gaming. And this is a different model altogether. Now the processor is stuck up in the cloud, and what is sent to you are just pixels. And Frank mentioned to you this morning about the difficulty of this is that the latency is the tricky part. I've personally tested several of these systems, and mind you, I live in an urban area, so it's perhaps not a totally good test. And I asked Neil to help me also test it because he lives wherever the hell we are right now. And he had similar results. And the net result is if you live in an urban area, your latency is such that you really can't detect it. I played first-person AAA shooter games on it, and the pathing was interesting. I did it through a thing called GeForce Now, which is a system that NVIDIA has developed. And what NVIDIA does is they direct you then to Steam, where you own the property, the game itself, and then you execute from Steam down into NVIDIA. So Steam thinks your computer is the NVIDIA server, and then you play across NVIDIA's network. And it was totally satisfying. I didn't believe it at first. I thought I had done something wrong, that I had something cached up or something was tricking me. So I flushed it and reloaded other games and so forth, and it just kept working. So it's a very exciting prospect, and it'll be available on smart TVs because it doesn't require a whole lot of local processing power. Power processing is all done up in the cloud on big Xeon processors. So here is what the processing power is going to, and is that readable back? The thing you're seeing is everything is up to the right as you would expect, but notice that the curve is kind of rolled off a little bit. And that's because we're pushing the limits now of silicon technology. Frank can speak about this for hours much better than I can, but we've got to find something new. So Moore's law is kind of slowing down in that we can't make the leaps in the nodal processes like we used to in the same time period, and it's getting more expensive to do that. But it is still going up. And other techniques, which are going to be here with us Friday night, I mentioned Friday nights for the students, is that it's not just silicon anymore that drives the future. Silicon has been the big engine for us for the last 3 decades, but going forward it's going to be other things, and one of those other things is certainly going to be software. So how far is that future? Well, I think it's right there, just right there. One of my big, fantasies, not the right word, but beliefs, one of my big beliefs is that I think augmented reality is the future. And I think that it's going to change our lives in a way that we just can't imagine today until you start to experience it. And in particular, when I talk about augmented reality, not this example, I use this just as a facetious example, but augmented reality with what are called smart glasses, glasses that are not obnoxious or call attention to themselves, that look like normal glasses and will allow us to see things that would be simple directions or perhaps a very immersive game, translations in real time, but also it will allow a recording of what we see and what we do. And it's that recording that I like because that becomes our personal black box. And we now have what we've always wanted, which is called an honest witness. There'll be no more of he said, she said. So if you have an encounter of some type and that encounter has an unfortunate outcome, there will be a record of exactly what happened. And if everybody's wearing augmented reality glasses, everybody will have the same record. So there will be no dispute about who was responsible or what the circumstances really were. You'll be warned beforehand about dangerous places to go to. You'll even be able to obscure things that you don't want to see. Say you're walking down the street and you don't like to look at graffiti, that can be painted out for you. Or you don't like to see garbage bags on the street, that can be painted out for you. So I think augmented reality is the future. And with that, okay, so finally, just to let you know, you can do augmented reality now, by the way. You just pull out your phone and you can do some augmented reality. And so I'm ready to be taken away now by the guys with the net. But I have do I have time for it?
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so I have a little video here of what the future might look like. And I'll say goodbye at this point. You can just watch the movie. Hit it.
Voy lo más rápido que puedo.
¿Has pensado en correr? Es saludable y eficiente.
Seguro que no hay más trabajos disponibles. Estoy para ser profesora y estoy haciendo mercados.
Y además puedes quedarte con los puntos de fidelización. Eres una mujer afortunada. Tienes que confiar en la aplicación. ¿Te sientes inspirada? Gracias. Chao.
¿Quién soy yo? No es lo que quiero decir. ¿Para dónde voy? No. ¿Puedo volver a empezar? Muy bien.
Estoy presente ahora. Estoy libre de mi ira. Estoy libre de mi tristeza.
Hola otra vez. Ay, no, cállate.
Buen día, Emilio. ¿Qué puedo hacer por usted?
¿Qué está pasando? Mis puntos están bien.
No se preocupe, sus puntos están seguros conmigo. ¿Le puedo ayudar en algo más, Emilio?
Yo no soy Emilio. Yo soy Juliana Restrepo.
Por favor, espero.
Hola, me alegro verte. ¿Qué puedo hacer por ti?
Mis puntos están bien. ¿Qué está pasando?
Tranquila, todo está bien. Parece que alguien está intentando vulnerar su cuenta. Espere mientras reinicio su dispositivo. Hola, Juliana. Me alegra verte. Hoy te ves hermosa. ¿Estás estrenando zapatos?
Ya lo arreglaron. Tengo que seguir trabajando.
Estoy trabajando en eso, pero necesito verificar tu información biométrica. Por favor, sigue la línea azul hasta el centro de servicio más cercano para confirmar tu identidad.
Sí, pero mis puntos están bien.
Todo está bien. Chao.
¿Qué hago? ¿Qué hago? ¿Qué es eso?
How about that? Let's give John a round of applause.